I am Elsa Ronningstam. I am a psychologist here at McLean Hospital, and I'm affiliated to Harvard Medical School, and I am going to talk tonight about narcissistic personality disorder and how it is related to borderline personality disorder, similarities and differences. We shall first take a look at normal narcissism, because narcissism is complicated and different from borderline. Narcissists range from healthy and normal to a pathological personality disorder and even malignant narcissism, so very severe disorders. It is a whole range, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to differentiate, and also sometimes it's very important to differentiate between what is normal, a little extreme but not unhealthy, and what is really starting to move more towards the pathological. We shall spend some time to talk about the narcissistic patient, the person behind the diagnosis, because there is often an external facade that may be totally different and uninformative about what is happening inside somebody who is struggling with narcissistic personality disorder. So we shall take a look at the different characteristics and differentiate what is normal, what is not normal. Then we shall look at the diagnosis, and we shall do a comparison of NPD and BPD, and take a look at some treatment recommendations, what to watch out for, and so. So, normal narcissism. What comes to mind when you hear normal, narcissism in general? Because maybe we should start that, so we get the baseline here. Any thoughts? Nobody have anything in mind? Nobody comes to mind? Nothing comes to mind? Well, okay, then I will put a lot of things in your mind. So, normal narcissism has to do with feelings and attitudes towards one's own self. That's where everything begins. So, core of normal health is self-esteem, self-protection, self-regard, a sense of agency, that you feel that you are in charge. When you move your hand from here to here, it's actually you who are doing it. You make the decision, you make the direction, and so. A sense of mastery, inner autonomy, control of thoughts and feelings, and it's also about self-preservation and normal entitlement. We have normal rights as human beings, and those are very, very important, including survival, protection, legal rights, human rights, and so on. Where do the range then go? How do we differentiate between normal and pathological? First of all, healthy narcissism co-occur with pathological narcissism and narcissistic personality. Even if you have somebody who has really a serious narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, which I'm going to call it, they usually have some areas, some moments when they can be pretty okay. Similarly is that all of us at some point can do things, react in ways that can stand out as extremely pathological. Let's say somebody comes and drives over and kills your cat, and for a moment you wish that that person is going to drive into the next tree. And that can be a normal reaction, an extreme reaction in an extreme situation. But you go about how to bury the cat and decide whether you should buy a new cat or go for a dog, and life goes on. But those types of revengeful, extreme reactions can be much more of a pattern when people have more pathological narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. They can also have periods of high functioning, be professionals in charge, etc., etc., and all range from more intermittent qualities, capabilities, or social skills. So we shall look more at that, but this is sort of one range. Another range is that disorder narcissists can be triggered in certain situations or be triggered in with specific features, like somebody's gets into bragging, for instance. Others can be angry, others can be very dismissive and withdrawn or critical. And then we have narcissistic personality disorder, which is more stable, long-term characterological function. And we have also this complexity that with NPD and pathological narcissism can be quite overt and striking. We can say, gosh, wow, here we have the narcissist of the evening. Others can have very hidden and deeply rooted narcissistic problems that are not easily visible, except for if something specific happens. So that adds to a certain complexity. That's why we need to understand a little more about narcissism. We usually divide pathological narcissism up in 3 big areas. Self-esteem dysregulation, self-enhancement, or what we call grandiosity, and that fluctuates with vulnerability, inferiority, and self-criticism. So this myth that narcissistic people are just grandiose turns out not to be the truth. There is a fluctuation in self-esteem. Sometimes people have fluctuations every day, and sometimes people have long time where the self-esteem is okay, something happens and boom, it hits a vulnerable spot. Emotion dysregulation, that can range from intense emotional reactions in certain situations or enduring feelings of anger, specifically anger, shame, and envy, or difficulties tolerating or processing feelings. And they can also include absence of reactions and feelings. Something happens and no sign of any emotions. Then we have interpersonal dysfunctions, difficulties with mutual interactions and intimate relationships. And relationships are used primarily to protect or enhance the self-esteem. So NPD in DSM-5, the diagnosis, those are the sort of typical criteria: grandiose sense of self-importance, fantasies of unlimited success and power, and so believe in being special and unique, requires excessive admiration, sense of entitlement, interpersonally exploitive, takes advantages of others, lack empathy, envious of others, and arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. This set of criteria has been here for quite a long time, and by now it is quite heavily criticized, because there is a lot of research that have shown, for instance, that nobody lacks empathy. You can have compromised or fluctuating empathy, but there are components in empathy which we shall talk more about. So, there is also a huge amount of research that has shown that underneath grandiosity there is vulnerability and inferiority, and that's caused the fluctuations in self-esteem. So there are shortcomings with this. First of all, the nature of narcissists from normal to healthy to pathological and malignant is not captured in this diagnosis. The phenotypes from grandiose to vulnerable, or that you can have that coexisting in each individual, is not captured. And the same thing is with that sometimes pathological narcissists can be very overt, and other times it can be very internal and subjective. That's not captured. And the self-regulatory fluctuations in self-esteem, emotions, empathy, and interpersonal relations, that it's not just black and white, either or, yes, no, present, absent. It is a range that can come and go. And as I mentioned, the research on empathy have shown a whole different range of empathic capability, and we shall talk more about that. So we shall take a look at the person behind the NPD diagnosis. Strengths and abilities in certain areas, especially in professional or social life, or in certain types of relationships that can help support self-esteem. Some people can be good parents when their children are small, but they can't handle it when the children grow up and become teenagers or adults. It becomes too tricky for the self-esteem. Other people are very good at in certain collaboration at work, but they can't handle their bosses. They can handle those who are under them, but not those who are superior, etc., etc. And there are more or less severe vulnerabilities and narcissistic patterns in other areas. Intimate relationships, parental role, as mentioned, moral and ethical standards and behavior. This kind of tweaking a little on the moral, ethical, without actually being directly criminal. The other thing is that the person behind the NPD diagnosis can experience themselves differently in different social and interpersonal contexts. In some contexts they feel confident and competent, in others they don't. They feel insecure, afraid, threatened, competitive. So, grandiosity is the first thing I assume we think about when we hear narcissism. And grandiosity, it's a core trait for distinguishing NPD. I have captured grandiosity as a self-enhancement, because there are many things that goes under an enhancement, increase of self-esteem. Grandiosity is again a little with this black and white, is either present or absent, but it is part of narcissistic self-esteem regulation that can go up and then suddenly it can go down and then can go up again. And it's reactive and it's state dependent. So for instance, was this guy who had worked in an office together with a colleague to solve a huge important problem. And he was shy and he had difficulties with women. So he comes out of this office after this project and is very proud of himself. Everything has gone well, everything got resolved, he's done his job. And then he meets a colleague and tells him this, and the colleague says, "But gosh, though, you should go and date this woman you have been helping. This is really great." And he suddenly gets completely ashamed, totally shaky, feels like he's falling down through the wall, and cannot continue to hold on to the self-esteem he had in his professional relationship. He had real problems with shyness and insecurity vis-a-vis women, but he was very good at his work. And that's how self-esteem can fluctuate. So changeability in grandiosity suggests that the diagnosis of NPD should not depend as heavily on grandiosity as has been suggested in the DSM. So then we have self-enhancement. That is sort of, I think, a better way of looking at grandiosity, superiority, increased self-esteem. It captures beliefs, fantasies, attitudes, behaviors, serves to avoid and protect against vulnerability, brittleness, feelings of insecurity. It includes a range of interpersonal, internal, self-sustaining attitudes. It's very self-driven, self-promoting, interpersonal behavior. And it also has sociocultural connection. Sometimes certain type of behavior is valued in one culture, but it's not valued in another culture, and can be indication of more off-track self-esteem. Interpersonal strategies for self-enhancement: superior, confident, charming behavior, admiring, attention-seeking, competitiveness. I'm total better than you. Charm, admiring, seeking, competitiveness. Then we have internal self-regulatory strategies, because those are more, what we saw here was more interpersonal. But that serves to sustain a sense of agency and identity and self-esteem, and protect against threats and intrusion, sense of feeling self-sufficient. I don't need anybody, it's just me. Or self-centered, I see me. There may be other things going on, but this is me. And also sense of control, especially control over thoughts, feelings, experiences, actions, decisions. Those are very important, what we call internal self-regulation. Self-sufficiency, it's related to independence, but also to supply for oneself, having confidence. And this is something that can be highly valued in some subcultures. We talk about the Western individualized culture, society, where you have to promote yourself. If you're going to get into college, you have to make a huge effort. Also associated with some interpersonal distancing, rejection, condescending attitude, and superiority. Self-centeredness tends to support identity and sense of control, independence, self-sufficiency, and it protects against intolerable, intrusive, threatening perspectives. The world revolves around me, and so does Saturn. Control that serves to maintain inner sense of mastery, cohesiveness, can be internal and focused on control of thoughts, emotions, but it can also be interpersonal, expressed in avoidant, manipulative, commanding, or uncommitted behavior. But everything centers around I do what I do. Perfectionism. That is a tricky thing, because there is normal perfectionism, there is necessary perfectionism. You know, everybody, that none of us want to go to an eye surgeon who is not going to do a perfect surgical job, or step on an airplane where the pilot is not committed to at least do it at least close to perfect landing. And there is, we also know, everybody who has or are in some type of competitive school educational situation, a set of straight A's leads to one direction, no straight A's leads to another direction. The perfect score is perfect grades can be very, very important, and actually sort of decide the directing life. But the problem with perfectionism is that when it becomes excessive and maladaptive, and when it becomes associated to being I am perfect. Not that I have done something perfect, but that I am perfect. If I do something perfect, I am perfect, and I have self-esteem. If I don't do something perfect, I'm not perfect, and then there is not self-esteem. So that then perfectionists start to become a real problem. So the other thing is when perfectionism has to do with self-appearance, concealing imperfectionism, or when it contributes to interpersonal problems, I can't stand my friends because they are not as perfect as I am, or that I am not perfect so I can't be out there in the world. It can be associated to excessive self-criticism, shame, anger, fear. Aspirations. That's also a very normal thing. Everybody has aspirations at some point on to what? Various things. And aspirations may be something that, say it's sort of more in the normal range. I'm aspire to change my diet, eating more healthy, which is a very important aspiration. Aspiration to run the marathon or whatever, or aspirations to get into this or that school, write this and this paper, etc., etc. And it's an important aspect of normal healthy development. But it's a test of actual potentials and capability in the process of learning, development and advancement in life. And it involves a balance between the known and the unknown. I know where I stand, I want to get there, and there is the road up. But when aspiration co-occur with pathological narcissism, then it can be driven by excessive self-enhancement. And where that normal, extreme, or pathological self-enhancement sort of ends and begins, that can be very tricky to evaluate. Some people have very high aspirations and can reach them. Others have high aspirations to stay as fantasies. And some people deal with their aspiration by getting more and more inhibited, full of self-doubts and self-criticism and insecurity. So there again, it's a matter of how do you deal with aspirations? How can you get sort of friendly with them? So then we have something that's called narcissistic perspective taken. So there is this guy here. This bad grades is lowering my self-esteem. So the teacher comes and says, well, then you should work harder so you don't get bad grades. So he thinks for a moment and then he says, your denial of my victimhood is lowering my self-esteem. So what happens here then is that what we call reversible perspective serves to sustain self-esteem and sense of control. The teacher is wrong. And the teacher, it's the teacher's fault that this guy's self-esteem is fluctuating. It's expressed as understanding and reaction to every experience from a position of identity perspective already taken. And it's a way of dismiss and avoid other people's perspective. Entitlement. That's a normal thing too. We have a normal social principle of equality, deserving and individual and human rights. But when entitlement starts to go into pathological forms, then it becomes unreasonable, connected with unreasonable expectations, associated with the passive attitude. I should be able to expect this. And if I don't expect, I can have strong reactions. It can also be related to inner experience of defectiveness. I had such difficult this with my father, so I expect that all my teachers should be supportive. It's sort of a compromised sense of deserving or feeling undeserving. That can also underlie this extreme attitude. Self-esteem fluctuations. This instability and fluctuations is one of the core disturbances. This is where we move from saying that people are just grandiose to that people have a fluctuating and unstable self-esteem. Hypersensitivity to criticism, for instance, tend to lower self-esteem. Can be context dependent, so as I described. A person can feel confident in controlling one situation and insecure and insufficient in another. It can co-occur with emotion fluctuations, so for instance, joyful feelings increase self-esteem, or negative feelings lower self-esteem. And then can also co-occur with intense reactivity. Vulnerability. This is something that especially recent research has shown that is very common with narcissism. An underlying something, it's coexisting an underlying self-enhancement, and it contributes to self-esteem fluctuations. And it can often be bypassed or unnoticeable because this is something that you don't primarily want to talk about. Some people with NPD are more openly vulnerable, but most can have a very, very effective base of shielding. It's associated with low tolerance for attention from others, hypervigilant readiness for criticism, intense reactions, especially shame-driven, aggressive reactions, low tolerance for others as well as own feelings, shame, envy, rage, and can be overtly noticeable in the context of ultimatums or failures, or when somebody feels trapped. Self-criticism. I have an inferiority complex, but it's not a very good one. That's also a central underlying disposition in pathological narcissism and NPD that contributes to fragility in self. Sometimes we have people with the NPD who can be extremely harsh and bombarding in their self-criticism. Sometimes self-criticism can help to motivate to do something good, but often self-criticism can lead to fantasies and expectations about failure and become very painful and vicious. And it can also actually prevent a constructive functioning. Empathy. Now we shall talk about empathy. Empathy is the ability to perceive the inner psychological state of others and to identify and feel the feelings and needs of others. So it has two parts. One is the cognitive part. I see that somebody is crying. And the other part has to do with the emotional part. I can feel the sadness that other person is struggling when he or she is crying. Then the third thing has to do with how to regulate what I'm going to how I'm going to react, my own feelings about this. So empathy is a complicated process that requires both sort of cognitive alertness and capability. I see what I see and I can understand what I see. Somebody's crying, I understand what that means. Emotional openness, but also a way of regulating your feelings so that when you give something back to somebody else, you can do it in a balanced way that really can be meaningful for the other person. And as I said, it is a very essential aspect of self-esteem regulation. People who have deficits or compromised empathy can feel very shaky about that. And empathy is also modulated by cultural values and personal developmental experience. In some cultures, for instance, you leave somebody alone if they have a problem. That's a way of respecting. In other cultures, you really gather and pay a lot of attention, and that's another way of paying attention and respect. And compromised empathic functioning can be caused by absence of motivation. I see that somebody is crying, but I am not interested in paying attention to this. Or it can be caused by deficits in cognitive or emotional functioning. That, namely, that I see that somebody is crying, but I don't really understand the emotional context of it. That's a compromised empathic reasoning. Some people can have a motivational reason. They see somebody crying, they don't want to deal with it. Others can see somebody crying and start to struggle so much with their own feelings that they are just paralyzed and overwhelmed, can't stand it and have to go leave the room. So that the emotional dysregulation plays a role. Others' empathy towards self can also be experienced as very dangerous intrusion. And that is why psychotherapy can be tough with people with NPD. And the narcissistic person may or may not be aware of this type of functioning and the effect he or she has on other people. Identity diffusion, that's who am I? Uncertainties in identity reflects fluctuations in self and self-esteem. If I am on top of my self-esteem, I'm one. If I feel insecure, then I don't know who I am. I can't recognize myself. And this is so often referred to in external context, relationship to achievements, affiliations to others, and it's associated to shame and anger. Envy, and others' envy on oneself. That is also desire to have something that belongs to someone else, and everybody knows neighbor gets a BMW or Mercedes or something that is outstanding. In some situations, envy can be a very good radar directing towards, I want to be a BMW too. And other times it can start up a negative vicious cycle that just feed into further negativity. So here again it's a matter of where and how the person is able to process envy, and when envy can get stuck into beliefs that others are overpowering, or beliefs that others are envious of me, instead of taking a look at and understand what the envy is about and make some realistic. Shame is another very painful feeling related to the awareness or exposure of something dishonorable and improper. And it involves a significant shift in perception from sense of exposure to shrinking and feelings of inferiority, powerlessness, incompetence. And shame can be expressed in different ways. Chronic low self-esteem lead to shyness and withdrawal, be very defensive and aggressive, or be intrusive or tormenting. The thing with shame is that it can be lying and percolating for years in the back of somewhere in the personality, in the memory reference, and pop up in a situation when something is reactivated. Aggressivity and rage. Again, it's an essential part of narcissistic self-regulation. It has to do with protective, controlling and destructive aims. Natural reaction when we are threatened in various ways. But in interpersonal situations, this sort of condescending, critical, competitive, domineering attitude, it can be internally expressed in harsh self-criticism. expressed in some ways in sadistic, more explosive, violent, or criminal way. But it can also serve to protect and enhance self-esteem and provide a sense of internal power, a safety. And it can range from chronic grudge, archaic fury, to absolute control, righting something wrong, or undue hurt to maintain self-esteem. So retaliation is central to pathological narcissism in response to criticism, humiliation, injury, or threats to self-esteem. And that can be more or less controlled and have various types of expressions, reconstructions, aggressive argumentativeness, and so on. It can also be shame-based, aggressive rage reactions that come on quite impulsively. Fear. That is something that maybe has not enough been associated to narcissism, or narcissistic personality disorder, but underlying fear of losing control, fear of losing position, fear of losing status, fear of humiliation, fear of shame can have be enormously important. Fear of incompetence, failure, and so on. And fear can be situational, but fear can also be indistinguishable. Also, fear of being overwhelmed, fear of feelings, fear of loss of control. Also an internal constant sense of what is coming next kind of thing. It can also be quite reactive in a very specific situation. And fear of loss of control is a very central thing. It can be triggered by internal as well as external experiences, sudden overwhelming feelings, sudden loss of control of thoughts, control of actions, plans, and so can be completely overwhelming. And this can be also major obstacles in treatment, because it's so threatening to have somebody else give other perspectives. Fear of failure, won't work out. They can motivate achievements, but they can also motivate procrastination and avoidance. And then we have something that is called emotional trauma. When we talk about trauma, especially when we talk about trauma for borderline, we talk about what we can say real trauma that is tangible. You see an accident, somebody dies. You see your father beat up your siblings, or you see sort of the in a thunderstorm, the flash hitting a house, and the house get on fire. So these kinds of extreme experiences. But with narcissistic trauma, they can often be hidden underneath because they are somewhat different. They are primarily caused by internal experience or subjective experience of a situation, and that threatens the continuity, leads to loss of an ideal person or well-being for oneself. An example of this is a young boy who was coached in baseball by his father, and the father was a community, so real man of the community, so he was very highly regarded, and all the kids looked up to him. And this boy started to get nervous, especially when he was going to hit the ball. so he couldn't control his bladder. And after a few such events, the father got irritated and said, "You can go and swim with the girls' team, but not play baseball anymore." And this may seem rather, shall we call it, a small event, but for this young boy, it meant a internal catastrophe of loss or difficulties to deal with, a sense of being demasculated, unworthy, losing his idealized father. And those kinds of experiences can actually leave scars and actually take the form of a trauma that is percolating somewhere back in the system. We should say a little about attachment too. Attachment is the affectionate bond between two people, between child and caregiver, and it's a very important thing. More recent research has really paid attention to that the early attachment play a very important role in children's development, and especially in personality disorders. The forms of pattern associated with certain characteristics of experiences. And for narcissistic personality disorder, there are 3 types of patterns that are specifically predominant. One is the dismissive, the second is the avoidant, and the third is the anxious, which is especially associated to self-esteem fluctuations. Dismissive and avoidance attachment is associated to self-enhancement, sort of a way to protect and against internal and external experiences and in interpersonal relationships. But anxious attachment is, as I said, this fluctuation in self-esteem, insecurity. And sum up, the person behind the NPD diagnosis, this is the person that we not see firsthand. It's not the one that is flagged. But can be confident, arrogant, insensitive or charming facade, interpersonal self-promoting, shifting and conflicting sense of self, self-enhanced, vulnerable, insecure and inferior, perfectionist, exceptionally high standards, aspirations, excessively self-critical and judgmental, and strong reactions to perceived threats to self-esteem. Humiliation defeats criticism. Any thoughts and questions so far? We have a little further way to go.
Are there any?
Well, there are now personality tests, both for specific traits, like for instance perfectionism, and for narcissistic personality disorder, and for functional stability and range. So there are, yes. But there are also tests for the fluctuations between self-enhancement, grandiosity and vulnerability, and so, yes. Just a little about the functional range. NPD is complicated too because it ranges from very high functioning people in professional leadership positions, vocationally competent, social interpersonally connected, so who can have temporary or situational difficulties. And then we have people with moderate to severe functional impairment, disabling narcissistic traits or accompanying axis 1 mood disorders, depression, bipolar disorder, substance use. We can see people with occasional criminal behavior. And then we have people with what we call severe malignant narcissism, who have more consistent criminal, antisocial, psychopathic behavior. So that adds a certain complexity to this diagnosis. So now we shall go into a new chapter, the NPD, BPD similarities and differences. I assume that you know more about the BPD, so we start up to go into how these diagnoses can be different. First of all, they overlap, or there's clearly a relationship. NPD traits in BPD range from 25 to 39. And BPD traits in NPD can be 10 to 37, but one or few NPD traits are common in BPD. So NPD, BPD overlap or are similar in emotion dysregulation, reactivity, unstable relationships, sensitivity to criticism, aggressivity, and some entitlement. But there are a number of differences. BPD has usually in their etiology parental separations and losses, experiences of abuse as two major components, while NPD has parental projections and expectations. Before the child is born, it's decided that they should go to Harvard Medical School, for instance. It sounds extreme, but it's not totally uncommon in this area. Or have assigned role or expectations. Parents get divorced, the child takes on the spouse role and so. Or the imbalance between gratification and age-appropriate reality anchoring challenges. It is called spoiling. But spoiling can actually cause a lot of problems with self-esteem. You'll never learn how to deal with reality. Attachment patterns are different. NPD has more dismissive and avoidant style, while BPD has the sort of this insecure and very preoccupied style. There can also be a joint dismissing preoccupied style and anxious style where NPD and BPD can have similarities, namely that a person with narcissistic person with borderline traits can be preoccupied with something and someone he or she has already dismissed long time ago. Unintegrated identity. Borderlines present with different aspects of internal world from moment to moment, but NPD masks fragmentations and diffusions in identity underneath self-enhancement. Intolerance. NPD has intolerance of threats to self-esteem. BPD has intolerance of aloneness. And they have done different reactions to that. They have differences in reactivity. NPD can be overtly angry, self-enhancing, and self-serving, or they can have totally hidden reactions, unnoticeable of others. And they have higher impulse control. BPD has more low impulse control and has more consistently noticeable range of reactions, including self-destructive behavior. Fluctuations in self-esteem in NPD and fluctuations in relationships in BPD. Here it's more inferiority versus self-enhancement. In BPD it's because clinging dependency and idealizations versus angry, dismissing, fighting. NPD has difficulties accepting dependent relationship. So BPD are ambivalent, clinging, and dependent relationships. NPD tend to not invest in relations with significant others, but they can engage in relationships that are that provides them with something. There is clear differences between cognitive and emotional empathy. NPD has intact cognitive empathy. They can see clearly what is going on in other people. But they have impaired emotional empathy and ability to share emotional experiences. BPD gets easily overwhelmed by own emotions, but has better capacity for emotional empathy and can share emotional experiences with others. Perfectionism. That's NPD in BPD. Perfectionism, aspirations, high standards can be a motivating factor to distance, remain focused, and in control. Perfectionists can actually make a borderline person sit down, start to study, get through the tests and the semesters and get the grades. And that can be quite helpful. Then we have self-destructive preoccupation, borderline trait in NPD. And that is a very paradoxical thing, because this can be a very controlled thing that, for instance, the narcissistic person knows that I can hurt myself or end my life when I want to, and that's on my term. And that tend to lead to a certain superior control. And it's NPD has higher impulse control than when it comes to preoccupation with self-destructive action compared to borderline. So it can lead to a certain control. Paradoxically, somebody with NPD can sit with a knife and know that they can cut their veins, but they choose not to do it, and that makes them feel good. And this is a very, very important thing to differentiate between when it comes to the urges in borderline to act destructively. So, we've come to last section here with treatment of NPD. I shall just provide some basic guidelines, because the treatment of NPD is complicated. There isn't just one treatment. A treatment of choice, best treatment, so depends very, very much on the individual's motivation, curiosity, an ability to relate and reflect, an ability to accept that there are problems, I can get help with problems, and so on. It also depends on external circumstances. So for instance, somebody who has got a message from his boss that if you don't go to treatment, you are going to be fired. You have to learn how to deal with your working team, your lab staff. You have to learn how to deal with the superiors, otherwise you will be fired. And that can motivate somebody to go in and learn how to deal with, be more interpersonally effective. While somebody else who says that, well, I know my wife thinks I'm not a narcissist, but I don't think I am, and she will hang in there, so I'm not interested. So these are two different external scenarios. One is pressing and conditional, the other is amorphous and unconditional. There are some different types of treatment for NPD. One is transference-focused psychotherapy that focus on defensiveness, underlying aggression, and enactment of especially entitlement and grandiosity. There is a very active, interactive exploration, and it fits certain type of people with NPD. Other is more schema-focused, cognitive, behavioral, learn how to handle different situations, focusing on changing intimate relationships, changing distortions, black and white thinking, and degree of perfectionism and such things. There is also the DBT, which can be very challenging for some patients, but for others it can actually be very helpful if they are interested in focusing on changing something specific. Initial psychoeducation, I am a very, very high advocate for providing clear education and understanding of problems, emotions, functions, mental states, and so it strengthens a person's sense of control and agency and ability to participate in the challenging process of doing psychotherapy or participate in treatment and change. And it supports patients' motivation and courage. Understand the purpose, understand that emotion is emotion, that can be challenging, it feels horrible, but you don't die, it's nothing to be afraid of, and so. Psychopharmacological treatment, there is no psychopharma medication that has proved to be effective for pathological narcissism. It is a too complex personality issue. And the narcissistic patients can be very hypersensitive when they get medication for depression or bipolar disorder, or refuse taking antabuse if there is a substance use or disorder. Just to be aware of, there are many mistakes. We are still really looking for how to, in an effective way, form alliances with people with pathological narcissism and NPD. And Dr. Igor Weinberg is going to speak next time, and myself, we have put together a few guidelines. For instance, that criticizing and confronting a person's self-enhancement or grandiosity is not a good way to go about it. Similarly, to engage in competitive or controlling or intrusive interventions. Taking a passive or non-challenging approach, not really engaging in a collaborative alliance about problems. That's not good either. And disregard underlying vulnerability, fear and shame. Those are some things to really be observant about when anyone starts a psychotherapy who struggles with narcissistic. Possible change, how do we know? What can be expected? Sense of agency is a very important. So you feel that you have less fear, more control, can tolerate some more criticism, can see things in more proactive, positive way, and take into account your own competence and potentials. Second thing is to ability to tolerate and modulate feelings. That can be a very challenging thing and may take some time. But with increased perspective and increased competence, people may see that it may not be necessary to get so angry. I can handle situation in a different way. Reflective ability to understand, become more aware of self-esteem and emotions, and not feel this enormous fear of what is happening. That's a major step forward. And similarly, ability to grieve, sadness, losses of wished for, hoped for self-states, relationships, goals, aspirations. That's a very important thing to do too. But it's also important to see that for some people it may be important with an acceptance of an unrealistic goal. For other people it may be very important to set up goals and aspirations. So, okay. Questions? I've talked a lot now. Mourning has to do with a sense of something that either is unattainable or that has got lost. So, for instance, when I talked about this boy whose father stopped coaching him in baseball, for many years that was sort of just something that was not talked about. But as an adult, reaching 40 with own children, he suddenly was able to grieve intensely the loss of the father he had admired and hoped for to be his role model. And that his father sent him to the girls' swim team, so to say, which was a rejection, a demasculation. Yes, exactly. It really did, and it brought it in from being a encapsulated vulnerability into something that I lost, something I valued. And those are the types of grieving processes that can be very important. Somebody lost his job, for instance, and after years of just devaluing and criticizing the boss and the company and blah, 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 he was able to sit down and say there were a number of extremely important things in this company that I really, really valued, and was able to grieve. Similarly, is broken relationships, marriages, losses of various kinds, that where the mourning is put aside. Things go a hectic life, and the anger and everything is sort of happy to move on. But then comes a point in life when the whole situation is revisited, and another set of feelings. Winston Churchill has historically been one of the main characters, political characters, for a more narcissistic personality disorder. Hitler moves into the more extreme, on the malignant, but Churchill has there has been monographs about Churchill's. But otherwise, there has been Salvador Dali, for instance, the artist, has clearly been considered narcissistic having a narcissistic personality disorder, and the evidence has been presented in monographs. That is when the self-esteem can go from being pretty high and competent and suddenly go down into a sense of incompetence. Example of this is this college kid. He was considered very, very bright, and on Friday he met with his professor and went through a project which he was going to write up, and things went well, and the professor understood his ideas and supported them, and he felt good about himself. And on Sunday he talked at an event in front of 15,000 people. It was a sports event, and he was giving some introduction. And at that point he had this idea that maybe he could become the next president of the United States, or one of the next presidents. So things went well. And then on Tuesday he was going to meet with his peers in his class to discuss this project he had discussed with his professor. And at that point he suddenly ended up with a horrendous anxiety to the degree that he couldn't even stay and go through, present his project and discuss the project. There, the closeness and intimacy of and the expectations of their criticism became so overwhelming, so he couldn't handle it. And that's where these sort of sudden swings and vulnerabilities can be. Many narcissistic people don't have that extreme, but it can be somewhat more like this. Okay, I can play the piano for my family and maybe a couple of extra people, but not in front of an audience of 100 people, or definitely not with 3,000 people. And for others, self-esteem blossoms with 3,000 people. Yeah, that's a very good question. Because for some people, aging can mellow out narcissistic problems. So for some people, challenges in narcissists belong more in the young age. How do I measure up? How do I find my way? How do I form a family? How am I a good wife, husband, and so on and so forth? And then when things stabilize, it works out. For others, every step in aging can be very, very challenging. Reaching mid-age, where I have gone, how far have I gone in my career? Reaching 60, 65, what am I going to do when I don't work? Reaching 70, 80, when function starts to diminish, can be extremly challenging for many people. And their self-esteem has sort of been consistent and good over productive years. And it can, so it's a little tricky. For some people, they have a capacity to do good. I mean, we take a high school kid. They know they can get A's. They've got 5 A's this semester. And that's sort of an anchored sense. So there, a B plus creates explosion. But for others who feel that, okay, I get the A, but it's not really me, and it can be taken away any time, and I don't deserve it, and so there you have another type of internal thinking and processing, and there the rage can be directed towards themselves easily, if that makes sense. Good question. There is a genetic component. So there has been something between 50 to 70% genetic in vulnerability in emotion regulation and propensity for anger reactions. But then what comes next is the attachment, the role assignments, the ability for the parent to see the child as a real child, the real child the child is, and move away from see the child as somebody they want the child to be. And from then on, there are much more such interactions. Because it is this early thing, to take sort of a schabloon thing, but parents says, okay, even before the child is born, he's going to go to medical school. He's going to be the first doctor in the family. And there is an attachment already with expectations. And every time the child takes steps forward, oh yeah, that's the next thing towards medical school. That the child isn't seen as just who he or she is. And another thing has to do with the overprotection. My child is a specialist, sort of I see myself in the child. And you protect the child against the reality of shortcomings. Because after all, a solid self-esteem is built up by knowing that there are rainy days, there are sunny days, sometimes you can, sometimes you don't, but things work, things don't work, but you go ahead. And the parents are there to pick up when things go bad, support and praise when things go well. So that's a normal thing. But a child that constantly learns that nothing bad will ever happen to me, or get into what we call a spoiled pattern, doesn't learn the hard thing of coming home and having failed, or the dog ran away, I couldn't hold her, whatever. It's that type of training, being aware of, building the solid self-esteem. As I said, DBT can be very effective when you have a patient who is motivated and want to learn and realize that if I don't learn how to deal with people, interpersonal effectiveness, or distress tolerance, or emotion regulation, if I continue to blow up or screw up collaborations or miss collaborative things or whatever, I will be fired. There you have a motivation to learn. For other people, a DBT skills training can be seen as very demeaning and primitive or beneath them. So that's very different. For such a person, it may be much more important to understand their own internal conflicts, or to be more specific as to what is it they are struggling with, and gear the treatment more directly to that. So I think so far I think we can agree that it has been more difficult to find a standard treatment, evidence-based treatment for NPD. Some NPD people can benefit from mentalization. Others are excellent at correctly reading other people's minds, and may not be motivated to use it in a way that can be constructive. But it varies a lot. So the thing is, first, before deciding which direction to go, to actually spend time building an alliance with a patient with narcissistic personality disorder, and explore and understand where they see and feel their problems, and what they can commit themselves to engage in terms of treatment. We don't have exact data for suicide in NPD, but we know so far that the nature of NPD suicides are more definite, not a cry for help, but an ending, so to say. And they have much less of parasuicidal acts or indications of I need help by making suicide attempts. The thing with NPD is that sort of it turns to be more definite. And it can fail, but the intention is more not to be found or not to be. So it has a seriousness. Okay.